Hey everyone, really sorry I can't be here today. It was obviously my intention to be so that we could go over taking your statement of intent and the 3 layers of the message that you've started to develop and start talking about now how to make sure you've got all the key building blocks to draft your kid's book. So this little video is of the page in your notebook, obviously dated today's date, the 26th of July, so that you can kind of work through some of the questions we will work through in class. And what I'll do is, on this page, as I go through the video, is I'll go ahead and answer some of those questions, much like we did with the examples that we did on the board and discussed yesterday. So there's 4 things now that you've got your message that you really need to start thinking about to be able to develop that story. The first one, and the one that is most obvious and important to the reader, is the characters. So when we think about the characters for our kids' books, really there are no limitations as to what we can do. Unlike a novel where we usually have human characters, you've got the choice to use animals, use objects, or a mixture of all 3 of them to be able to deliver your message. It really depends on what you want to get across. The more abstract the message, the more likely it is you want to use things like animals and objects, because they let us focus on those characters and they let the concepts sink in a bit more. If you use children and adults, then sometimes the reader will try to make that immediate connection. So when we looked at an example yesterday in class, we came up with the concept of trust as being one, and that the lesson for the 5-6-year-old is they have to be careful who you trust. When you get a little older as a teenager, you realize trust needs to be earned. It's not just given. And then finally, when you're an adult, you realize how quickly trust can be broken and how difficult it is to repair. So trust is abstract. It's hard to kind of see. So in this case, I might use animals and objects. And like we discussed yesterday, I'm going to go with a slice of bread and a toaster. So I'm going to go with objects and food as my particular characters for this book. Now, in terms of the characters, again, I said I would go with some bread, so I call him Bobby the bread, Tom the toaster, and a number of other kitchen foods and accessories to get that message across. The reason I want to use the bread and the toaster is we're going to use that kind of metaphor of being burnt, right? And that's trust. Someone breaks your trust, you feel like you got burnt. So you'll notice that even in the characters' names, and we'll go through that in the next question, I'm just going to use alliteration right away, because alliteration in names for kids' characters and in kids' books helps basically retain that character for the kid. It's easy to remember, it rolls off their tongue, and becomes something that immediately they can recognize. So I'm not going to give them silly names because they are actually abstract objects already. I'm going to go with standard names, but I'm going to use alliteration. And again, remember, in this standard, we're looking at deliberate use. The deliberate use of certain techniques. So obviously the use of alliteration is deliberate, and it's to make the reader be able to identify the character very, very quickly. Moving on now, you need to think about settings. Now, again, because it's a kid's book, your setting can be anywhere you like. But because I'm using kitchen utensils, and I'm using pieces of food, I'm going to set it in a kitchen. Now, the kitchen's realistic enough for kids to recognize, but also it's a little bit of fantasy in it because when they're away, the objects come to life. Now, is a kitchen symbolic in any way? Well, it's a place that we cook. It's a place that is nourishment. So, food and cooking leads to nourishment, which again is essential for living. The kitchen also seems to be the place where sometimes decisions are made. So we've got things like, we always hear about the kitchen table, where family gets together and discussions and decisions are made. Right, so it's got that whole sense right off the bat that if your family's together, those are the people you should trust. And should it be relatable to the reader? I think so in this case, yes, because I want to balance the kind of the personification of the objects to a setting children can relate to. Right, so having that balance there, I mean, if I'm going to have objects that speak, let's put them in a setting that's a bit more realistic so the kids have something to ground the story. Now, every story has conflict. I mean, if we don't have any conflict, we don't really have a story. We just have a kind of factual description of what people are doing most of the time. And it's the conflict that intrigues us as an audience because we all experience conflict. Now, in storytelling, in literature, there's generally four main conflicts that we often kind of see used. It's sometimes a character versus another character. And in this case, it could be that, again, Bobby the bread tries to make friends with some of the other items in the kitchen, like Carrie the cereal, and Carrie the cereal says, back off, I've got breakfast covered. You know, the bread might try to make, a relationship with a croissant, Charlie the croissant, and Charlie's like, no, 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 you shall not interfere in my place in the kitchen. And so we get this character versus character conflict that may eventually lead to Bobby, striking a relationship with Tom the toaster, and then not realizing as he gets to know him that he'll eventually be burnt. You can also do a character versus an event. So it could be that, Bobby the bread is sitting in the kitchen, unaware that they're just about to have a children's birthday party, and that Bobby is soon to be obliterated when he is used to make a heap load of fairy bread. Character versus social or societal expectations. There's a lot of talking about bread not being great for you. Obviously, there's a rise in gluten intolerance. There's discussions about carbohydrates. And so perhaps, Bobby is left on the shelf for far too long because people see him as unhealthy and unnecessary anymore. And then probably the most, not necessarily underused, but one we don't see a lot in kids' books, is the idea of the character versus themselves, that inner conflict that they have. And perhaps Bobby is concerned that, he's just processed bread. He's not natural. He's now a product of his environment. He's tried too hard to be someone else his whole life. And he is now just a processed piece of bread, rather than those natural ingredients of those wonderful loaves that you see in specialist bakeries. So, as you can see here, you can go almost any way in terms of developing your story. For myself, Bobby the bread will have conflict with several other items in the kitchen. This is a croissant, cereal. Perhaps he'll also have conflict with some fruit. Sorry, my spelling's atrocious this morning. All sorts of other items in the kitchen. He'll have that conflict with those other items and begin to doubt himself when he meets Tom the toaster. So once we establish what this conflict is, we have to determine, what is it that character wants, what's standing in their way, and how do they get around that? And so in this case, what Bobby wants is a friend. I mean, and that's something that kids can relate to. We want a friend, right? And ultimately someone we can trust, which is the whole point of this book. What stands in his way is that the other kitchen foods don't want Bobby to interfere with their group replace. You know, the cereal and the croissants and the fruit, they don't want to be replaced with a loaf of white bread or a loaf of wheat. They want to be the main items in the kitchen, and so they're reluctant to be friends. You know, so they exclude Bobby, and he stops looking for a food friend. So this is how now is he going to get around this obstacle. And the reason he does that is, well, Bobby befriends a toaster. Tom the toaster. And so by befriending the toaster, he's got around it. He's not going to foods to be friends anymore. He's looking outside of that and giving somebody else who's a little different a chance himself. Now, of course, he'll find out that Tom the toaster has felt the same. That Tom the toaster has been excluded by the blender, by the microwave, by the oven. And in fact, Tom the toaster, much like Bobby the bread, feels out of place, like they've got no one. And it's that sharing of that hurt between the toaster and the bread that develops kind of a vulnerability, a trust amongst them. And it's that trust that ultimately gets snatched away very quickly in the final page when a human being pops Bobby into the toaster. Now, even though Tom didn't do it, when that toast comes flying out and Bobby is no longer bread and he's toast, which again could be a bit of a pun, he has been burnt, another pun, by Tom. He feels like he's been burnt, and that trust is all gone. And that leads us to the final thing we need to think about, and that's the narrative structure. So if we're going to tell that particular story about Bobby the bread, Tom the toaster, and what happens and how we feel burnt when trust is lost amongst people, then I probably want to use a chronological order. I want to kind of go start to finish, rather than start at an event and work my way back, or mix up the order of the story. The reason that most children's books use a chronological sequence is because, depending on the age of the kid, it's easy to follow, it's easy to predict. So if you're going to stray away from that structure, you have to really consider why, and it has to be pretty solid. So today's lesson is really about answering those questions located on this page about your characters, about your setting, the conflict that you're going to kind of start with, and the narrative structure. If you've got all this information ready by the end of today's lesson, then when you come back in on next week, you'll actually be able to take this now and start setting up some key moments in the story to start then building the action and the dialogue around. I hope this has helped. I again apologize I can't be there today, and if you have any questions, please email them through. I'll do my best to get a response to you early this weekend. Thank you.